The philosopher is the guardian of the eternal truths. The highest aim of the soul is union with the good. The unjust man is like a city at war with itself. The just man reflects the order of the cosmos within himself. The philosopher turns his soul toward the eternal good. Wisdom is the path to freedom. The unjust soul breeds conflict within and without. The good soul seeks harmony in all things. Virtue is the light of the soul. The unjust man is blind to his own corruption. The philosopher is the friend of truth and enemy of falsehood. The highest education is to turn the soul toward what is eternal. The unjust life is against nature and therefore painful. The just life is in harmony with nature. The soul that loves truth will rise to the divine. The philosopher is the lover of wisdom and truth. The unjust man destroys himself before he destroys others. The aim of philosophy is to purify the soul. The good soul is harmonious and free. The unjust man is divided within and therefore weak. The just man is at peace with himself. The philosopher lives for truth, not for wealth. Virtue is the alignment of the soul with the good. The unjust soul is in disorder and pain. The wise man sees beyond appearances to the truth. The soul is immortal because it is self-moving. The good life is one that seeks virtue above pleasure. The unjust man is a slave to his own passions. Justice is the order of the soul. The philosopher seeks truth above all else. True wisdom is knowing the difference between what is eternal and what is fleeting. The unjust life is the unhappy life. The just life is the happy life. The soul is the eternal part of man. Wisdom is the cure for ignorance. The unjust soul is enslaved by desire. The greatest education is to learn to love the good. Virtue is the beauty of the soul. The wise soul seeks order, not chaos. The unjust man is never truly free. The philosopher is the true guardian of the city. The soul is winged and longs to fly to the divine. The highest good is the contemplation of truth. Knowledge is light to the soul. The unjust life is a life of misery. The wise man does not seek power, but justice. True friendship is founded on virtue. The body is mortal, but the soul is immortal. The pursuit of wisdom is the pursuit of the good life. The just man is the friend of the gods. The unjust state is divided and therefore weak. Virtue is the harmony of reason and desire. The lover of wisdom is never satisfied with shadows, but seeks the light. The true philosopher seeks what is beyond appearances. The unjust man is at war with himself. Wisdom is the guide of the soul toward the eternal. Justice is the harmony of each part of the soul performing its proper function. True love seeks the beauty of the soul, not the body. The tyrant is the most enslaved of all men. Virtue is the natural order of the soul. The soul that loves justice is never corrupted. The philosopher seeks not wealth or honor, but truth. Courage is standing firm in the face of fear for the sake of the good. Education turns the eye of the soul from darkness to light. To seek the good is to seek what is eternal. The unjust man is always in discord with himself. A wise man is never less alone than when he is alone with his thoughts. The body is the prison of the soul. The true statesman rules by wisdom, not by force. The good is the highest object of knowledge. Philosophy is the medicine of the soul. The unjust soul is divided against itself. Virtue is knowledge rightly applied. Justice is giving each his due. The wise man looks to the eternal, not the changing. The pursuit of truth is the highest task of man. The just man does not harm, even when wronged. Knowledge is remembering what the soul already knows. The good soul is like a well-tuned instrument in harmony with itself. The life that is rightly lived is guided by reason. The true aim of education is to turn the soul toward the good. The philosopher is the midwife of truth. Courage is the power to resist fear in the service of the good. The just state is the reflection of the just soul. Truth is not in many words, but in right words. The man who seeks only wealth will never find wisdom. Virtue is the soul's health, vice its disease. The strength of a city lies not in its walls, but in the character of its citizens. Education should lead the soul toward the light, not leave it in the shadows. The true lover of wisdom seeks what is eternal, not what is fleeting. Wisdom is the harmony between reason, spirit, and desire. The just man is happy, the unjust is miserable. No soul is willingly ignorant. Ignorance is the result of neglect. Philosophy is a preparation for death, not in despair, but in freedom of the soul. The good life is one that is lived in pursuit of virtue. The beginning of truth is the recognition of our limits. The wise man is he who knows his own ignorance. True love is the pursuit of the eternal. Justice is the highest virtue of the soul. The greatest mistake is to think that knowledge alone makes a man good. The soul that loves wisdom is immortal. Truth is the beginning of every good. The wise man alone is free. Justice is the practice of minding one's own business. The highest end of education is to love the good. Knowledge leads to truth, and truth to virtue. Philosophy is the greatest good which gods have given to men. Goodness is unity, harmony, and proportion. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Courage is a kind of salvation. The soul of man is divine and immortal. Virtue is knowledge. Justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the hearts and souls of citizens. The soul that seeks truth will never be content with appearances. Knowledge without goodness is dangerous. The beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms. Philosophy is the highest music. The soul of the just man is in harmony with itself. Knowledge becomes virtue when directed to the good. Man is made for the contemplation of truth. Education is the foundation of every well-ordered state. True friendship can exist only between equals. The soul is eternal, uncreated, and indestructible. Ignorance is the curse of God. Knowledge is the wing with which we fly to heaven. Virtue is the health of the soul. Good people do not need laws to act responsibly, while bad people will find ways around the law. The soul is the source of all motion. To love truth is to love wisdom. The object of love is the pursuit of the whole. A good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death. Knowledge is the food of the soul. The direction of education determines the future of society. Justice is harmony in the soul and in the state. The wise man will want to be with those who make him better. The soul is immortal and never perishes. Philosophy begins in wonder. Wealth is not to be measured by money, but by the absence of want. The greatest victory is victory over oneself. The measure of a man is what he does with power. The highest form of knowledge is empathy, for it requires us to suspend our egos and live in another's world. We do not learn, and what we call learning is only a process of recollection. The beginning is half of the whole. The soul of the philosopher alone is fitted to attain to truth. Love is the joy of the good, the wonder of the wise, the amazement of the gods. Knowledge without justice ought to be called cunning rather than wisdom. False words are not only evil in themselves, but they infect the soul with evil. A state which is not governed by the best men will soon be governed by the worst. Good actions give strength to ourselves and inspire good actions in others. No one is more hated than he who speaks the truth. The object of education is to teach us to love what is beautiful. Virtue is harmony. The soul is the true self. The most virtuous are those who content themselves with being virtuous without seeking to appear so. Excess generally causes reaction and produces a change in the opposite direction. There is in every soul an unextinguished light of truth. He who commits injustice is ever made more wretched than he who suffers it. Courage is endurance of the soul. The wise man will want to be ever with him who is better than himself. Education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. Excess of liberty, whether in states or individuals, leads to excess of slavery. The soul never thinks without a picture. Justice is the bond of men in states, for the administration of justice is the principle of order in political society. All men are by nature equal, made of the same earth by one workman. The first and best victory is to conquer self. Wealth does not bring about excellence, but excellence makes wealth and everything else good for men. Man is a being in search of meaning. Opinion is the medium between knowledge and ignorance. The soul of man is nourished by learning. Ignorance, the root and stem of every evil. Knowledge becomes evil if the aim be not virtuous. The soul of man is immortal and imperishable. No man should bring children into the world who is unwilling to persevere to the end in their nature and education. Good actions give strength to ourselves and inspire good actions in others. False words are not only evil in themselves, but they infect the soul with evil. Justice means minding your own business and not meddling with other men's concerns. The man who has a good soul is truly rich. Human behavior flows from three main sources: desire, emotion, and knowledge. To love rightly is to love what is orderly and beautiful in an educated and disciplined way. The madness of love is the greatest of heaven's blessings. Love is a serious mental disease. The direction in which education starts a man will determine his future in life. Excessive liberty, whether it lies in state or individuals, seems only to pass into excessive slavery. Better a little which is well done than a great deal imperfectly. Music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. Education is teaching our children to desire the right things. The soul takes flight to the world of ideas when it remembers what it knew before. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. The man who makes everything that leads to happiness depend upon himself and not upon other men has adopted the very best plan for living happily. A good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers. The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. Good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will find a way around the laws. Opinion is the medium between knowledge and ignorance. The first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself. Knowledge which is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind. The measure of a man is what he does with power. Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something. The beginning is the most important part of the work. An unexamined life is not worth living. Courage is knowing what not to fear. The greatest wealth is to live content with little.